Good morning, everyone. I warmly thank you, Ivan Williams, who is a Research and Development Advisor at the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, who is an expert of psychosocial risks in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This is a video interview entitled Psychosocial Risks, a New Challenge for Health and Safety. It is part of the research, occupational health and safety legislation and insurance coverage in the context of Fourth Industrial Revolution. This research began in April 2019 and will end in April 2021. The project, commissioned to the Center for International and Comparative Studies of University of Modena and Reggio Emilia, DIL, was co-funded by the National Institute for Insurance Against Accidents at Work, INAIL. ADAP Foundation served as a partner of the project. The objective of the research is to study the impacts on health and safety regulation on workers of the changes brought about by the first industrial revolution, such as the rapid transition from a physical to a more intellectual dimension of work, the rise of innovative forms of interaction between man and machine in the era of exoskeleton, the emergence of new organizational models made possible by new technologies. I think about smart working or co-working, for example. All these changes determine the emergence of new risks, not only physical, but also psychological ones. This research project is aimed at examining health and safety regulation in new work environments, both in terms of protection and obligation provided by Italian legislation on health and safety at work and workers' insurance. The results of the research will be collected in several publications. In addition to current research, which is carried out using a comparative and multidisciplinary approach, some materials will be published which can be used as a guide by occupational health and safety professionals. Within these research activities, it is decided to involve experts from other countries to deepen knowledge and sharing the results of the project with those who have been dealing with these issues for years. So, after this brief presentation of the project, we can start the video interview. I thank Ivan Williams for being here today. I remember Ivan is Research and Development Advisor at Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. So, the first question for you, Ivan. What do you mean by psychological risks in your study? Is there a legislative definition? Are there European and international guidelines and trends?
Thanks, Cecilia and ADAPT, for your kind invitation. So, first of all, I think your research is really timely. It is the case for regulatory frameworks to determine if they are fit for purpose in the new context of a digitalized world of work. And this was irrespectively of COVID-19. So now, throughout the pandemic, has really made the business case for these research findings to be available. Psychosocial risk, it is true that for many years the focus has been on work-related stress and more recently on the work-related aspect associated to depression, anxiety, or other mental health outcomes. I think there's a need to shift from mental health disorders to work-related contributing factors. And basically, the management of psychosocial risks relate to the work design, so the organization and social factors, such as excessive work hours, poor leadership within the business, lack of culture in the organization, poor levels of communication, pressure from the workers or from work production, and bullying, violence, and harassment. All these hazards have the potential to negatively impact workers' mental health and well-being. And it is true that from a European perspective, we do have a fairly good knowledge of what work-related psychosocial risks entail, but we also need to be conscious that this terminology might not be applicable to to other jurisdictions or other countries that might use workplace mental health and well-being or psychological health and safety in the workplace. So this is something that is worth noting. Well, if there is a legislative definition, I think this is probably the big elephant in the room, and absolutely this is a key gray area. So I think it is fair to say that the existing legislative approach is quite fragmented. Historically, there's been a lack of political will to develop and implement new initiatives, and we can see this in how many countries do have a detailed definition. Well, not many countries do have a detailed definition of psychosocial hazards and risks in their legislation. And even when they have some kind of a specific legislation or clauses, it is true that the fact that regulations exist don't imply enforcement and compliance. As for the rest of many countries, especially within the European region, they normally take it into account by existing laws, and this is normally occupational health and safety laws that tend to talk about safety risks, but not that much about the mental risks, but those tend to be included. And I think from a horizon scanning regulatory perspective, there will be also moving forward some key developments at the EU level and also at the international level in the coming months and years that will have major influence on this issue. We are now seeing this in different legislations that some countries are adopting and enacting, such as the right to disconnect, that is much related to ICT, information and communication technologies, or technology developments. And in terms of trends, it is a bit difficult to go through some of the, considering the current context of work, but it is true that from a European perspective, we do have the EU Health and Safety Directive. There's been also some developments in the past few years or in the last decade through a social dialogue, like the work-related stress agreement of 2004, and also the harassment and violence at work agreement from 2007. We also have some international guidelines or standards and regulations. More recently, we do have the C190 convention and its accompanying recommendation, violence and harassment in the world of work. This is quite a novel approach, and it's basically the convention and recommendation is still in its infancy, but some countries are already adopting the convention as such. And I think we also need to be conscious of the international framework through the Sustainable Development Goals. So, for example, Sustainable Development Goal number 3 and number 8 do tackle some aspects of mental health and well-being, and also like decent work associated to good working conditions. And finally, and this is probably more relevant to the business industry, there's an upcoming international standard organization standard that is going to take the form of a guidelines called psychological health and safety in the workplace, guidelines for managing psychosocial risk, that it will take a risk management approach to managing this risk. And this is due to be published by summer 2021. So Cecilia, as I was saying, lots of developments coming and in the current agenda.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for your answer. So we can move forward. The second question for you is, are we talking about a new phenomenon regarding psychosocial risks? Is it an issue related to new technologies, or is it destined to worsen or to improve with the organizational and employment models in place in the fourth industrial revolution?
Thanks for the question. I think you will probably agree with me that we are far from talking about a new phenomenon. So basically, as far back as 1959, the WHO, the World Health Organization, noted how psychological impacts coming from automation, but even in the prospect of automation was or have the potential to be associated to decrease not only like physical but also mental health. So yes, we're talking about so many years ago, and we've seen how when it comes to technology, the pace of change sometimes is drastic, but when it comes to things like artificial intelligence and automation, it will still take some time for those changes to have impactful connotations within the workplace. But of course, risk caused by technical innovation it makes a real difference in the workplace. So things like the evolution of traditional risk of burnout, mobbing, or harassment. We're now seeing things like online harassment or cyberbullying, also with strong work-related aspect. Again, work-related stress, as we know, could evolve also due to the impact of technology to what is called in some countries like techno stress or technology associated stress. It could become an occupational risk that didn't exist before, or that could become worsened due to new work processes or the effect of technology. And I think that at the same time, we need to be mindful of the current momentum, especially of workplace and mental health and well-being. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has been a trigger to this situation to be higher in the agenda. I mean, not only in the policy agenda, but also in the business agenda. And this follows other movements, such as I was mentioning, the Sustainable Development Goals, or even like things in relation to human capital management as well. And when it comes to technologies, it is true that we need to understand that technology in itself is not harmful. We can see really good examples of both tech for good and technology for bad as well. But it is the way it is used that can be harmful for workers in particular. Therefore, it is not the technology that creates the risk for safety and health and well-being of workers, but it's basically the way it's being implemented. And we now seeing this kind of debates, in particular when it comes to the development or the adoption of artificial intelligence technologies in the workplace. So, in agreement with other authors, it is true that there's a need to better understand the people aspect when it comes to implementing these technologies. And it is true that I'm one of many advocates calling for a human in command approach when it comes to technology, and for technology to be more inclusive, so having conversations with those that are basically working in the workplace. At the same time, as I was mentioning, we need to be mindful, and we need to be conscious of the current context. So it is true that the COVID-19 crisis is accelerating the adoption, the widespread adoption of AI and automation technologies in businesses. They are basically investing more and will be investing more in the short future. There's also a trend in the composition of jobs into tiny micro tasks. And we've seen this as part of the so-called gig economy, where workers can be, working from almost anywhere, digitally distributed, can do any kind of minor task. Also, we've seen some issues in relation to electronic performance, online reputation, and algorithmic reputation. And this is also much associated to the gig economy. We also having issues in terms of workplace surveillance and monitoring, especially in the current context of working from home, and then more from a health and safety perspective, or from an occupational perspective, there are what I define also as an emerging risk in this particular area. So things like distressful interaction of workers, of humans with robots will be an increasing issue moving forward. Blur work and home boundaries. Again, we're seeing this in the current context of working from home for so many different professions. There's also a fast pacing of work and work intensification, and this is normally, or is becoming driven by technology developments, as we are seeing in big tech companies such as Amazon or others.
Thank you, Ivan. Another question linked to this one. Do you think there is a link between these new these psychological risks linked to the new technologies and new way of working, and the dishumanization and alienation of work stressed by Marx, for example, related to the first industrial revolution?
Absolutely, but we also need to be careful on the conclusion that we may realize, because it is true that there's also a strong media aspect and about public perception. So it is true that we increasingly getting from the public media and that kind of message that, for example, robots will be taking out our jobs, and we're seeing in reality that that's not the case. As I was saying, the pace of change when it comes to technology developments do take place, and there are many technologies such as AI, even things in relation to people analytics that aren't that advanced. But then it is true that at the same time we're seeing how companies use good tech for not so good reasons, and this of course has a knock-on effect on workers' health and well-being. So I was earlier on mentioning things in relation to the intensification of work. So this is a key aspect. You could arguably believe that technology should help you and should improve your work-life balance, but in many professions that's not particularly the case.
Okay, thank you very much. Now another question for you. We change the topic. What role can be played by social partners and collective bargaining? I'm asking this with particular reference to work-related stress.
Yes. So when I was going through some of the policy-related developments, it is true that there's also been for the past few years some social dialogue-related developments as such. From a European perspective, it is true that the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of Europe have been and are quite active in this field. So I reckon a recent report from the Council of Europe enhancing well-being at work that advocates to include the perspective of well-being at work horizontally into national legislations within the European Union. So again, this is quite a novel approach, isn't it? Also from a workers' representative, from employers' representative perspective, especially from trade unions, for the past few years, they've been advocating for the need of legally binding requirements not only in the field of work-related psychosocial risk, but also in the field of work-related stress, and basically through the form of a European directive. And we will be soon witnessing the European Health and Safety Strategy Framework for the period of 2021 and 2027. And again, I'm not that optimistic to see these kinds of developments, but I'm also one of those advocating for these issues to be formally included within the new EOSH framework. So as you can see, so many different debates talking about the same issue, but at the same point, we need to be mindful of the complexity of the issue. We've also had really good examples from labor inspectorates. I think that it was a few years ago. They developed and implemented a managing stress and psychosocial risk at work campaign that was quite successful in different national jurisdictions. But we also need to be mindful that labor inspectorates are currently struggling. We've seen this as part of the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to financial resources and human resources. So there's still much focusing on the safety aspect rather than the psychological or the psychosocial aspect. And I think from a social dialogue perspective and probably from a collective bargaining perspective, the issues is still far from being resolved, even when it comes to accords or agreements from multinationals. It is quite difficult to see for example, work-related stress or psychosocial risk clauses within collective bargaining nowadays. But I think it's something that has the potential to change.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. Are you aware of any best practices? I'm asking this with particular reference to the theme of work-related stress as usual.
Okay. Again, from a European perspective, that I think is much of the focus of your piece of research. For example, in Switzerland, there were measures to prevent psychosocial risk as an intrinsic part of collective agreements with, and this was also encouraged by trade unions. We also know that in the Nordic countries, they tend to have robust foundations, not only on organizational and social working environments, but also on the prevention of work-related stress. So this is something that they tend to tackle through different approaches, as I was saying, through the work from labor inspection, from collective bargaining as well. I think this is basically much aligned within the national context of how they tend to work more on protection and prevention rather than on compensation, that other countries tend to be much more focused. And then I think also from a business perspective, things are changing at a slow pace. So we're seeing increasingly more policies and practices in the form of codes of conduct, also in relation to work-related stress, improvements of the organization culture, companies working on mental health and well-being, raising training and awareness, for example, through stress management training. This is something that was a bit weird, probably going back 10 years ago, but now it is not anymore. Companies, practitioners, and professionals are becoming a bit more knowledgeable on the topic and starting the conversations in different sectors, especially in challenging sectors such as education, services, construction, and so on. But at the same time, we don't need to be naive, and it is true that there are SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises that are and will keep struggling with this particular issue.
Thank you very much. So the last question for you. Do you think regulatory or even institutional changes are needed to face psychosocial risks? Or rather, is it a matter of company and union training and culture? Are new professionals needed in the company to handle these types of issues?
Well, Cecilia, we need to be conscious that the current approach has not been working in so many different countries, even from the so-called industrialized countries. Of course, from an international standpoint, we do have really good examples coming from countries like Canada or Australia. But from a European perspective, the approach is absolutely more fragmented. Historically, there's been a lack of regulations and standards for psychosocial risk management as opposed to other similar areas. And I think changes that are happening are taking place in the right way. So as I was mentioning, the Sustainable Development Goals, so we can increasingly see a better alignment of workplace mental health and well-being within some of the goals. And I think also that from a regulatory perspective, it is while it is well known that higher levels of awareness go in hand with robust regulatory frameworks, there's still a long way to go, and public policy, companies, professionals, and civil society, they really need to invest in this particular issue. That's the only way to move forward. As I was mentioning, especially when it comes to occupational safety and health legislative frameworks, they tend to be much based on compensation. And this is quite intrinsic to the physical safety or physical injuries, rather than in prevention. Also, laws not aimed at prevention, but focusing on compensation. And I think this is quite a reactive approach. So the approach needs to be more proactive.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this interview. The interview is finished. Thank you very much for this focus on psychosocial risks that exploded within the first industrial revolution. And thank you very much for having stressed the importance of finding solutions that ensure not only physical but also mental and psychological well-being for all workers. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And again, I'm really looking forward to the findings of this research that is absolutely coming at a really timely moment. And one of the good outcomes that I can anticipate of this research is that it will not only help to raise awareness, but also to build the business case for professionals to be more knowledgeable on the topic. And I'm not just talking about legal professionals as us, but also to other professions like human resources, occupational safety and health professionals, occupational psychologists, basically those that tend to work with people.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Keep in touch. So, thank you very much. Bye.